Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today we conclude our massive deep dive into the year 1986 with a look at movies, news, and what the Beach Boys were up to in the fourth quarter of the year, the months of October, November, and December. Let's get started with movies. As usual, the fourth quarter of the year was a big time for movie releases, both potential big blockbusters and movies being released in time for Oscar consideration. Released on October 3rd was Round Midnight, a dramatic portrayal of the turbulent lives of jazz musicians starring saxophonist Dexter Gordon. Also released that day was Children of a Lesser God, a romantic drama co-starring William Hurt that will earn a Best Actress Oscar for its star Marlee Matlin. And also released on October 3rd, Tough Guys, another fish out of water film about two tough guys, Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas, trying to make their way in the modern world after 30 years in jail. Released a week later, Kathleen Turner went 30 years in the opposite direction, traveling to the 1950s in Peggy Sue Got Married, giving her character a chance to revisit her life choices. And also released on October 10th, True Stories, co-written, directed by, and starring Talking Heads frontman David Byrne with John Goodman. It told quirky stories of strange characters in a small Texas town. A week later came The Color of Money, a very belated sequel to 1961's The Hustler. It stars Tom Cruise and Paul Newman, who will win an Oscar for Best Actor, reprising his role as Fast Eddie Felson. On November 7th came Sid and Nancy, a biopic of Sex Pistols' Sid Vicious and his girlfriend Nancy Spungen, with Gary Oldman and Chloe Webb in the title roles. Also released on November 7th was Something Wild, a crazy romantic comedy starring Melanie Griffith and Jeff Daniels. Released on November 14th was Hoosiers, an acclaimed drama starring Gene Hackman as a troubled man coaching his small-town basketball team toward the state championship. On November 21st came An American Tail. Even the mice could be fish out of water in 1986. In this animated family film from Don Bluth, Fievel the Mouse immigrates to America from Russia in the early years of the 20th century. November 26th saw the release of Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. The crew of the Enterprise return in their own fish out of water story, time warping from the 23rd century to San Francisco in 1986. The emphasis is on humor. It'll become the most successful Star Trek film so far and the fourth highest grossing movie of the year. Two comedies opened on December 12th, both received poor reviews. The Golden Child starred red-hot box office draw Eddie Murphy. Despite mostly negative reviews, it'll be one of the year's biggest box office hits. The Three Amigos starred Steve Martin, Chevy Chase, and Martin Short. It won't be the box office smash of The Golden Child, but it'll be a solid hit in the face of its own mostly negative reviews. Released on December 19th was Little Shop of Horrors. Roger Corman's outrageous low-budget 1960 horror film had been turned into a campy musical in 1982. Now the musical was being turned back into a movie, starring Rick Moranis as Seymour Krelborn, who grows the man-eating plant Audrey 2. Audrey 2 is voiced by Four Top singer Levi Stubbs. Despite high expectations, it won't do as well as either The Golden Child or The Three Amigos. Opening that same day, and about as different as you can get stylistically, was Oliver Stone's Vietnam War drama Platoon, starring Charlie Sheen. It'll win the Oscar for Best Picture of 1986 at the Academy Awards ceremony on March 30th, 1987. Turning to news in the fourth quarter, on October 4th, CBS News anchor Dan Rather is assaulted on Park Avenue in New York by an unknown man who inexplicably calls him Kenneth and repeatedly asks, "What's the frequency?" Rather isn't badly injured, and the incident remains a bizarre mystery for years. In November, reports begin to surface of a secret and potentially illegal scheme in which the Reagan administration had been selling arms to Iran and diverting some of the money from those sales to aid rebels in Nicaragua. The White House at first flatly denies any of this happened, but as more information emerges, their position becomes more nuanced. Soon known as the Iran-Contra affair, it'll begin to dominate news in 1987. On November 29th, screen legend Cary Grant dies suddenly in Davenport, Iowa, where he's touring with a stage show titled A Conversation with Cary Grant. He was 82. Among the hot holiday gifts this season are camcorders, which are becoming smaller and less expensive. They are vastly superior to Super 8 film. A lot more home taping is going on, laying the groundwork for funny video TV shows and sex tape scandals to come. And what were the Beach Boys up to in the fourth quarter of '86? In our last episode, we talked about their guest appearance on the NBC sitcom You Again, which aired on October 15th. On a more personal Beach Boys note, it was October of 1986 when I located two intriguing Beach Boy boots at a record convention in Long Beach. Adult Child and California Feelin' contained a lot of tracks I had heard about, but never actually heard before. The sound quality was pretty good and there was a lot of interesting stuff. I was most impressed with It's Over Now and Still I Dream of It, which I had read about in Byron Priest's book, but never actually heard before. I'm not sure how long these had been around. They were probably fairly recent. It could have been as much as a year or so, but I doubt it was more than that. Anyway, the best of this has been released officially now, but at the time it was a real revelation. On December 12th, the Beach Boys performed a concert on Waikiki Beach in Hawaii for the television special The Beach Boys 25 Years Together. This being the mid-'80s, it was a deluxe all-star show with a big roster of guest performers joining the Beach Boys on stage, some cameo appearances, and probably every swimsuit model in Hawaii. The group take turns reading their introductions and stage patter off of cue cards with the same conviction you get from presenters at the Grammy Awards. They all do fine with it, but there's often a clear, "I'm hearing this for the first time as I'm saying it," expression on their faces. Guest performers include old friends like Glenn Campbell, who performs Jimmy Webb's In Cars before joining the group for a medley of Little Deuce Coupe, Little Old Lady from Pasadena, and I Get Around. Three Dog Night, which at the time consisted of Danny Hutton and Corey Wells, sing Darlin' with the group. There are some showbiz legends like the Everly Brothers who joined the group for Don't Worry Baby, which of course they'll record with the Beach Boys on their Some Hearts album, which will be released in 1988. That segues unconvincingly into Get You Back. They cut away to shots of boats and use harmonies from the record in an apparent attempt to cover some kind of snafu in the transition. The Everly Brothers wind up their appearance with Wake Up Little Susie. Another legend, Ray Charles, performs Sail on Sailor with the band in an outstanding performance that's probably the most fondly remembered part of the show. Then there are appearances from the Hot in 1986 crowd, including Dallas star Patrick Duffy, who thankfully doesn't sing. Instead, along with Glenn Campbell later in the show, he appears in segments narrating Beach Boy history. Former Saturday Night Live star Joe Piscopo does a comedy bit on the beach with surprise guest Don Ho, and later returns with a mercifully short Springsteen parody, Surf in the USA. Gloria Loring from the daytime soap opera Days of Our Lives appears, resplendent in what will eventually become known as mom jeans. She duets with Carl on her recent hit with Carl Anderson, Friends and Lovers, and on I Can Hear Music. It's kind of interesting to see Carl duetting and performing out from behind his guitar. The Fabulous Thunderbirds, having a big year with their hit Tough Enough, front the Beach Boys on a thumping version of rock and roll music. Jeffrey Osborne turns in a pretty nice lead vocal on God Only Knows, although he doesn't seem all that familiar with the lyrics. Paul Schaefer from Late Night with David Letterman joins the band on organ for Surfer Girl, Surf City, and Surfin' USA. Belinda Carlisle joins the group for Wouldn't It Be Nice in a cover I enjoyed, but I expect some people found her voice annoying on it. On her own, she does Band of Gold, Frida Payne's 1970 hit, which she had covered on her recent album Belinda and which was her new single. Additionally, the Punahou Varsity Cheerleaders join the Beach Boys on stage for Be True to Your School. The Beach Boys play all the expected hits with a few minor surprises like California Dreamin' and Carl's Heaven. Everybody comes on stage for the finale of Good Vibrations and introduced as a new song by Brian, which it was, Spirit of Rock and Roll. The song continues as the closing credits roll. I appreciated the Beach Boys band getting a nice clear credit. I'm not much enamored with Spirit of Rock and Roll, but in this setting it sounds pretty good. The show will be broadcast on ABC on March 13th, 1987. I'm not sure how live the sound is by the time of the broadcast. Those instrumental breaks sound pretty perfect, and the harmonies seem pretty full for a live concert on a beach. In the case of Get You Back, anyway, the harmonies seem lifted right off the record. If they did play around with the sound pretty liberally in post-production, I really can't blame them. I'd heard Beach Boys live shows on radio and television earlier in the decade that sounded terrible, probably much worse than they actually sounded in person, so I can't blame them for not wanting to go through that kind of embarrassment again. The show is much better in hindsight than it seemed at the time. The group looked good, and along with their backing band, they really seemed to have it together on stage. And even those 80s stars whose inclusion made me groan at the time now make it kind of a fun period piece. Just 5 days later, on December 17th, according to the Beach Boys in Concert book, the group flew to Anchorage, Alaska to play a one-off concert with Brian filling in for Mike, who was ill. Now that sounds like a unique show. Apparently the Anchorage show was their last concert of 1986. Before we close out the year, let's take a look at the top 10 records on the final chart of the year, December 27, 1986. At number 1 on the album chart was Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band Live, 1975 to 1985. This had gone to number 1 on November 29th, shortly after its release, and will stay in the number 1 spot through the week of January 10th, 1987. I'm sure this was under a lot of Christmas trees in December 86. At number 2 was Slippery When Wet by Bon Jovi, still in the top 10 from the beginning of the quarter, slowly rising toward number 1 on January 17th, 1987. At number 3 was Third Stage by Boston. Their debut album had gone to number 3 back in 1976. 2 years later, their second album went to number 1 for 2 weeks. Now, 8 years after that, they had their biggest hit album of all. This had gone to number 1 for 4 weeks, beginning back on November 1st. At number 4 was an album that had slowly been rising the charts since its release in April. Bruce Hornsby and the Ranges' The Way It Is kind of unique in 1986 for featuring acoustic piano. It will eventually rise to number 3 in March of 1987. And at number 5 was 4 by Huey Lewis and the News, still in the top 10 from the beginning of the quarter. At number 6 was Paul Simon's Graceland. Nobody was much interested in Paul Simon in 1986 or paying much attention when this album was released in August. So it took a while for people to realize he had done a pretty excellent album here, working in collaboration mostly with South African players. It entered the top 10 on November 22nd and will peak at number 4 on April 4th. At 7 and 8 were a couple more albums that had been in the top 10 as the quarter began. At number 7 was Lionel Richie's Dancing on the Ceiling, and at number 8 was Madonna's True Blue. At number 9 was Every Breath You Take, The Singles by The Police. It had reached its peak of number 7 a week earlier on December 20th. And Cinderella's Night Songs had just entered the top 10. It'll head all the way to number 3 for the last 2 weeks of February 87. The top 10 singles on that last chart of the year were at number 1, Walk Like an Egyptian by the Bangles, in the second of 4 weeks at number 1. At its number 2 peak was Everybody Have Fun Tonight by Wang Chung. At number 3 was the title track from Duran Duran's album Notorious. It'll peak at number 2 on the next chart, January 10th. Shake You Down by Gregory Abbott was at number 4. It'll go to number 1 on January 17th. The Way It Is by Bruce Hornsby and the Range was at number 5. It had been number 1 on December 13th. C'est La Vie by Robbie Neville was at number 6. It'll go to number 2 for 2 weeks beginning January 17th. Janet Jackson's Control was at number 7. It'll reach number 5 on January 24th. And War by Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, a live cover of Edwin Starr's 1970 hit from the new live set. It had just reached its number 8 peak, where it will stay for 3 weeks. At number 9 was Stand By Me by Benny King. The record had originally gone to number 4 for Benny King back in 1961. It was back on the charts as the title track of the hit movie. It was in the second of its 4 weeks at its number 9 1980s peak. And Don't Get Me Wrong by The Pretenders was at its number 10 peak. And on December 31st, now a tradition in its 12th year, Dick Clark rang out 1986 and rang in 1987 on New Year's Rockin' Eve with musical guests the Commodores, the Jets, the Miami Sound Machine, Smokey Robinson, and the Bangles. And that, at long last, will bring us to the end of our very deep dive into the year 1986. I hope you found this fun. In fact, I hope you found this Wang Chung. I look forward to your comments on this. Next time we'll move on to some other period of pop culture and Beach Boy history. Meanwhile, please hit like and please subscribe if you haven't. Thanks very much for watching, for hanging in there for all this 1986 stuff. We will see you next week with a brand new topic. Thanks. Bye.